Welcome to the Developmental, a podcast about the messy, beautiful ways grown-ups grow up. Here, we explore turning the science into the day-to-day practice of adult development in teams, homes, organizations, and life. Welcome everyone. I can't wait to jump into today's conversation with a leader who has a passion for vertical development and uses it in his day-to-day work. Marti Hughes is a Principal of Organisational Leadership at Tennis Australia and has been involved with leadership and capability development for the past 20 years. Vertical development has become a passion subject for Marti in recent years after he's been introduced to the works of researchers such as Bill Torbett and Robert Keegan, and later with the support of another thinker in this space, Nick Petrie, Marti has been introducing vertical development into leadership programs at Tennis Australia. You'll find links to the work of these three thinkers in the resources for this podcast, and hopefully you'll dive a bit more deeply into the great work that they have been doing. Marti originally hails from Ireland, having grown up during the Troubles, like many of the youth of the era. He then moved to England to study politics at the University of Leeds. While at Leeds, he met his wife, Shaheen, who encouraged a move further afield to Perth, Western Australia. Marti had a 20-year career with Lion, an organization known for its strong focus on leadership and culture, before exploring the world of consulting and then finding himself at Tennis Australia. They have lived happily in Perth for the last 26 years and have two boys who are nearing the end of high school. I am very happy to share with you my conversation with Marti. I've learned a lot and I look forward to your thoughts and questions, and hopefully you'll find nuggets of wisdom that you can take into your own work from Marti's hard-won experience. Good morning, Marti, and welcome to the Developmental Podcast.
Morning, Alice. How are you?
I'm super excited to have you. And this is kicking off really, this conversation is kicking off our guest conversations. And I really wanted to kick it off with a leader who walks the talk of vertical development and does the messy work of bringing development in organizations, because we often look at this from very theoretical perspectives, and I was so excited to hear your practical perspective. So thank you for joining me for this conversation.
No, I'm excited too. I'm looking forward to exploring sort of the messiness of how this works for me and how it can work for others.
Yeah. Me too. And I'd love to start with a question around how you came across this idea of vertical development.
Yeah. Well, I think probably like a lot of people who sort of play around in this space, my first introduction to it was Bill Torbett's HBR article on 7 stages of development. And that one article really had me hooked. I was so intrigued by the idea of it. Like any good researcher, that took me down like many rabbit holes and led me to many other wonderful people who work in this space. And but yeah, it was that initial article from Bill that really made me think about leadership development in a different way.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious, Marti, what was it about that article that kind of shifted your perspective, or that you found maybe unusual compared to other approaches on leadership you had encountered before?
Well, I suppose that it was the fact that there was a map, if you like, for development, and this idea that we make sense of the world from different perspectives, and that when I was reading the article, I was really doing a lot of personal reflection as well, of going like, how how does this make sense in my own life and my own journey? And I was able to, no, I don't know how accurate, but like I was able to quite easily map my own developmental journey from just really scraping the surface of this, and probably quite a simplistic view of it at the time, but it really appealed to me because I could look back on some of the some of the big challenges that I've faced in my time and in my career. And this allowed me to put a bit of a framework around it and to make sense of some of those changes.
Mm. So it started with a personal reflection, as I understand it, where you made sense of things that had happened and ways in which you had grown before you actually took it into your work.
Oh yeah, most definitely. It was plenty of exploration for myself of what it meant. You know, I I do like to read, so I was happy to like jump into the theory, and was lucky enough to get in contact with Nick Petrie and be able to like bounce ideas off him, and he was very generous in his sharing. And a lot of his work really sort of simplifies a lot of the theory, um, and that allowed me to start to go, well, if this works for me, like how well could it work for other people that I'm actually working with and coaching and supporting. And from there it was a few little experiments with different people that I've got in my team or around me that we started to actually play around, and got a very similar response from them to the response that I had, which was, wow, this, I wasn't aware of this, but it helps me explain some things that I haven't been able to explain before.
Mm. That's fascinating. And I am going to include actually some resources around Nick Petrie's work in the podcast page, because I think what he does is really awesome in translating this work to make it applicable. And I'd love to stay a little bit with that story, Marty, around the insights you have had and what did it clarify for you? And I know that you've got an amazing, rich life journey. And I
Yes.
was curious whether you'd be willing to share with us a few of those insights that, looking back and connecting the dots in hindsight, this perspective of adult development helped you grow or make sense of things that you had lived through perhaps and learned from, and put
Yeah.
them in a new light.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Um, so the first sort of thing that really became blatantly obvious for me, in retrospect, was when I'd grown up in the north of Ireland, during the Troubles era, and that was, for lots of reasons, that was a peculiar environment. Um, and it was very one dimensional, in that the troubles took up all of our energy and all of our focus, and we were sort of probably quite narrow minded in terms of that was the life that we were living. When I was 19, I moved to England to go to university at the University of Leeds, and that was such a culture shock for me. Um, I it was quite incredible, really. I went to study politics, and I was massively surprised, firstly, by the fact that it was in England. Um, and obviously the English play a big role in what happens in the north of Ireland, but how unaware people were of like the environment in which I'd grown up. And these were students studying politics, and really were very, very unaware of, what was happening just, 60 miles across the water. But culturally, it was very different from me, from how I'd grown up, and I really struggled with it. Um, Particularly in my first year, I really struggled with integrating, with fitting in, with any sense of belonging. In fact, I was rejecting all of those things, and the it just wasn't working. Um, in retrospect, was desperately lonely in that first year in England. Even though I did have a couple of Irish friends, um, that way of perceiving the world, of identifying very strongly as a child of the Troubles, and that sense of Irishness was it was holding me back. It wasn't allowing me to participate in the environment that I'd gone into. And, it was only sort of quite late in the year where, I'm there probably was a conscious decision to go, I need, like, this is just not making sense to me anymore. Like, I can't, and it was this catalyst of, you're going to fail and you're going to have to move back. You're going to have to leave this, or you're going to have to make sense of it in a different way to be able to fit in. And, when that change happened, it happened quite fast. And, I went from being completely miserable to actually having the time of my life, to meeting all sorts of new and wonderful people, from all sorts of different backgrounds, and just having changed my perspective on that and the way that I made sense of it, and was able to let go of some of the things that were holding me back. And, for me, when I sort of read the adult development theory, I'm going, well, that was opportunist moving into to diplomat, like, because it was very important for me at that stage to fit in. And when I did start to fit in, and did start to feel like I belonged, everything made so much more sense. And for the next couple of years, that was what drove me, that need to belong, which is such a strong characteristic of the
Yeah.
diplomat stage.
I think it's such a beautiful, powerful example of something that we see in the adult development research over and over again, how adults grow into that next octave of development when their way of looking at the world just no longer makes sense. The current lens no longer makes sense. And it sounds to me like that is exactly what you've experienced in that transition. I'd love to ask you, Marty, could you identify what was the thing that shifted for you that allowed you to kind of lean in and get curious about the people that maybe initially you were rejecting? What was in your mindset or in your thinking that you felt has shifted, to allow you that freedom or to make those different choices?
Yeah. I think it was a need. It was like a deep need
Mm.
that that wasn't being met. So, like, how I was behaving and acting wasn't serving the purpose that I needed, that I was looking for. So it really was the need to make it work,
Mm-hmm.
was what drove me to start to see things differently. And um, I suppose it's about, like, what wasn't making sense, and, like, why that wasn't making sense. So a little, you do have to do that self-reflection and introspection of going, why am I holding on to the things that I'm holding on to,
Yep.
and how are they serving me? And, I think for me, the catalyst was to really recognize that they were no longer serving me, and I'd be much better served to see things from a different lens. and,
Yeah.
and also when I think about, sort of like, when, again, Nick talks about, like, colliding perspectives as one of the instigators for growth in a vertical capacity. And when I opened myself up to listen to other people, I ended up with a really good group of Jewish friends. Now, when I identify that because growing up in the north of Ireland, we were just homogeneous. We were like white Catholic or white Protestant. There was nothing else. And then suddenly living in a completely different environment, and my Jewish friends obviously they had their own stories, but they were very different stories to mine, and hearing their perspectives and how they were making sense of, some of the traumatic journeys that their families had made was really fantastic for me, because it challenged me to go, your story is not the only story. Like,
Yeah.
your story of trauma is not the only story. Like, there are multiple stories from multiple dimensions. And when you start to open yourself up to hearing those different stories, and, that may like differ and even disagree to your own, that really can help be that catalyst.
Yeah, and that kind of leads me to one of the questions that I hear a lot from people when they come across these theories. This is so interesting, but what's the value of this? Because it sounds like every shift into a new perspective, into a new stage or octave of development comes with turmoil, comes with some dissolution of your previous identity. You have to outgrow yourself in some way, and that is deeply uncomfortable. So why is it worth it if you think it's worth it? And I know you believe it's worth it because
Yes.
you're investing so much in getting deeper into this exploration. But I'd love to hear your perspective as somebody who's living this rather than theoretically just studying it. Why would you say that discomfort is worth embracing? Because you could have said no in a sense, or you could have maybe not lent into that discomfort potentially, but you chose to. And I know you've done it multiple times since then.
Yeah.
Why is this trouble worth it? Going through all this
Yeah,
trouble.
yeah. And look, yeah. Well, I think when you can look back on the changes in your life, particularly, those early octave jumps, through opportunist, diplomat, expert, and you look at how your life im has improved, when you can identify where those moments were. And, when I say moments, it could be like, it could be a year, it could be lengthy periods of time. Doesn't necessarily happen in an instant. But when you look at, for me personally, when I look back, I go, gosh, I had ended up having a much better experience whenever I'd lived through the turmoil and actually started to see the world through through a different lens. That I was making sense of it in a different way. When I can chart those points in my life, it exponentially got better for me.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's probably why I'm still challenging myself today to like do this work, and to lean into like the messiness and the uncomfortableness of transformation, because my own experience says is that there are better things to come, and life will be more fulfilling for me as I manage to understand more about this transformation and transition.
Mm. Did you find it was more like a straight line? Because I think that's one of the criticisms we hear, and I
Mm-hmm.
know you've heard it as well around, is it a stairway to heaven? Kind of you discover this type of growth and you kind of lean into the next stage and the next stage and that's it? Or when you say messiness, I'd love to hear
Mm-hmm.
what the messiness is as you experience it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think my very probably naive initial review of my life was like, yes, it is this like staircase, and you just walk up and you move from one stage on to the next. But any sort of deeper analysis will show that it doesn't work quite just like that. Um, and there are lots of when I look at my own journey, um, there are areas of fallback where I've literally just lost the capacity to be able to do what I did before, and I'm only really learning about this sort of concept of fallback now in a more deeper way. But the more I do, again, the more that makes sense. And if I'll give a really specific example of that, when I was made redundant from a role and an organization and an industry that I absolutely loved and had really um, created a lot of my sense of identity through. When I lost that job, um, a lot of that identity crumbled with it. But one of the things that, again, like sort of just in retrospect, and I remember feeling at times that I literally could not do what I'd been doing before. So, even the depth of my conversation that I was having with people, I felt was such a shallow version of the conversations that I'd been having or capable of having previously. And now when I look back on that, I absolutely had, due to, you know, a very specific circumstance, had lost the capacities that I'd had only, only months previously. And at the time I was genuinely really concerned about myself
Mm-hmm.
then, because I couldn't articulate that. I didn't know how to understand that. I didn't know how to break that down. Um, and to your question of where the value of this work is, like for me, being able to explain particular moments and circumstances in your life it's actually very reassuring, because when I look back at that now and I can put these words like, I'd fallen back, I'd lost that capacity, and then I can understand that that's actually was another catalyst for growth. It doesn't make me fear those things. It actually makes me want to, embrace them and seek them out where I can, um, and lean into those challenges, because I know that there's good stuff on the other side, even though it might feel horrible and uncomfortable at the time.
Yeah. And that's such a profound thing to reflect on, particularly in the leadership context that both of us spend so much time in, where performance and constant progress and kind of transcending your limits towards the next edge, whatever that is, all the time is the focus. Whereas actually what we know is that fallback and this allowing yourself, giving yourself compassion really for those moments when you just lose your capacity for thinking in complex ways and you don't show up as you wish you would,
Yes.
to recognize those as actual moments of growth, um,
Yes.
requires a lot of courage, I think, and letting go of some of those beliefs around what performance and what success should look or feel like.
Yeah, so much. And that's um, definitely what I'm experiencing, where I'm trying to do the work from a leadership like perspective.
Yeah, I'd love to dive into that, because you're in a role at Tennis Australia where you're creating these learning experiences for the organization, and
Yeah.
there's a lot of responsibility on this organization's shoulders to be the custodian of all things tennis really in this country. And we know how much people love this sport. And I imagine the drive and the need to perform and perform that role in the best possible way is always present there. So tell us a little bit about your work, with leaders, and how have you brought this adult development lens into the work you're doing?
Yeah. So, the our starting point, and it's funny that you just mentioned a minute ago, like, this constant need for performance and step up and always, working at the edge. We conducted a collective leadership assessment, which is one of the tools from the leadership circle. And that really looks at the organizational leadership culture. And what it does is it identifies two things. It identifies where your leadership culture is at now versus what the opportunity is or where people would like it to be. And some of the things that we identified there were really around this need for constant improvement, more like, the productivity was unsustainable. Um, and then when I took the lens of looking at that, what I felt was we didn't need more vertical development, or sorry, horizontal development. We didn't need to build people's skills in um, project management, etc. Like, we're already world class at those things, but it's how leaders show up for their people that can make such a big difference in terms of how people feel when their productivity is being stretched. And that's when I decided that this vertical development, this story of our lives, and being able to help leaders recognize their story. And once you can recognize the past and the present, you have a much better opportunity to define the future for yourself. So that was the context of where sort of we ended up starting our leadership development programs with vertical development.
Mm. Would you be keen, Marty, to share a little bit about what does a vertical development program look like? Because I hear that question a lot, and
Yeah,
people in the learning and development space, they are often keen to hear lived examples of, how do you recognize that your program is actually developmental, or creates or is designed to create that vertical development versus your typical awesome soft skills horizontal development kind of program?
yeah. Well, look, I'm happy to share. We've got some great feedback on it, but it was just my interpretation of how we could go about this, and um, bringing together a couple of different tools and experiences. And so, yeah, I'm happy to sort of step you through
But
what we
I'd
did.
just love a few examples of,
Yeah.
activities or approaches or
Mm.
things in which you've, in a way, challenged the traditional way of doing leadership development and introduced this lens. And also
Yeah.
keen to hear how it was received by
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
leaders.
Yeah. Well, look, the first thing that we did in terms of flipping the traditional leadership development program on its head, when we came together for the first time, I think everybody was collectively expecting to be sat at a desk with 5 or 6 people with mints in the middle, and me to bore them to death with PowerPoint presentations and talking about leadership theory. Um, so we didn't do any of that at all. We we ended up in a very cool building up on the 40th floor, overlooking the city of Melbourne, and we were sort of in couches and bean bags and comfortable space, um, and really how the, the day went. I basically shared my story with the group. And I didn't really talk so much about vertical development theory. What I had around the room was I had the 7 stages of development. And as I told my story, I moved around the room and I let people observe what the stage was as I was telling my story. So people got an experience. They probably learned more about me than they ever needed to. Um, but they got to understand that these developmental stages, and I moved backwards and I moved forwards, and they could see that it wasn't linear progression for me, and that at each stage of moving from each transition involved some level of pain and angst and a transition. So, within a couple of hours, without really talking about the theory at all, I'd given people a journey, and people were, I mean, they were very kindly listening to me, but at the same time, they're also processing
Mm.
immediately, going, "Gosh, that makes sense." That transition. While they have a different story to me, they can see the transition, and they've suddenly got words, and it was a it was a real it was a big morning, and but people really got a lot out of understanding these stages by hearing somebody else's story.
Yeah.
rather than being talked to about theory.
So what did you notice in the follow-up of that day and other work that you've done post that day
Yeah,
in how this having this awareness that we're all on a journey and a lot of the things we do as leaders have to do with the lens that we are inhabiting in that particular moment of our lives, and that perhaps that these lenses, the awareness that these lenses are just lenses, we can challenge, we can change. What has been some of the impact you've noticed in the leaders you're working with, and perhaps in the initial intention that you started this program with to challenge that hyper performance focus and kind of understand that we've reached the limits of horizontal, so how can we increase our internal capacity for
yeah,
complexity?
yeah. So I think, I mean, one of the big things that we got from it was a much deeper understanding of, as leaders, as humans, so that we are, we're not just the title that we do, we're not just the job that we do, but like that we're all human beings. And once we all started to recognize, firstly, our own stories, and then listening in and sharing on the stories of others, we were just creating a much deeper connection amongst a group of leaders that didn't have it before. And they immediately started having the ability to have conversations at a deeper level than they were previously having. And they had language. They had language to put around it. We had a particularly great meeting, and I was really just observing in this meeting. But the group had got very, very, very achievement focused, very focused on task and outcome. And one of the leaders in the group was able to go, "Hey, can we just like pause for a second?" And he was able to say, "If we remember, like we've got very task focused here, we're very achiever. Like, how could it be different? Like, how could we approach it from what if we took a different viewpoint?" And really, he was approaching it from a later stage, but was able to use the language, and everybody else in the group
Yeah.
where it was able to go, "Yep, totally. We didn't recognize it in the moment, but now that you've called it out," and suddenly the conversation was a very different conversation.
So it almost allowed the group itself to self-regulate, to pattern interrupt from having this awareness, catching themselves going into the familiar pattern or way of doing things. And what I'm hearing is sometimes it takes one person to catch it.
Yes,
If the language exists, then the whole group kind of becomes self-aware in that particular moment and can shift the course of a conversation or the outcome of a meeting.
totally, totally. That was going a very particular direction, which was very organizationally on cue. Um, but there was one leader was able to recognize in the moment, and we ended up having a very different conversation with a very different outcome.
Yeah. And that
So
all, oh, sorry,
tangible, yeah, it's like real tangible benefits.
tangible benefits. And that also, I think, is such a great and interesting example of an ability that emerges as we grow into these later stages, which is to be able to observe ourselves during action instead of just getting caught up in the heat of the moment and reacting. We're able to take that metaphorical balcony view and actually see the pattern that's playing out and assess whether it's useful or not. And if it's not, call it out and shift out of that pattern in the
Yeah,
moment.
yeah, very much.
What excites you most about continuing to do this work and experiment with it, Marty?
Um, what excites me about it? I mean, the impact that it's had on, um, I mean, myself personally, the couple of people that I work really closely with in my team, and then some of the leaders that we've worked in. I mean, those that have really embraced it, they are showing up to work in a different way. You know, um, and what excites me is the more people that we can influence to show up in a different way, in a way that is more enabling for others, in a way that like really promotes the human side of leadership, in a way that allows us to recognize that we all like are on journeys and we all have different, we're all at different junctions on those journeys. But the more that we can create awareness of that, I think the better organizational outcomes that we will get.
Is there anything that you're hoping to see in terms of those organizational outcomes? Sometimes people ask, this might be an amazing tool to create and foster a more constructive, a more conscious culture. And we know that's a driver of organizational performance. But if we zoom in on that organizational performance question just for a moment, what are you envisioning might become possible with this growth, with this vertical growth of more and more leaders kind of touching in and stepping into those later stage capacities in the way they work day to day? What can be the business benefits, in a sense, for the organization in the long run?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if I talk more generally about organizations rather than our own, I think, the employee is changing, has changed. Like the COVID environment in the last few years has made people reevaluate their relationship with work. And as leaders, it is absolutely critical that we recognize and learn how to how to be able to engage those employees in the way that they now want to be engaged, because ultimately, most organizations can't run without their people and their people being engaged. And if we stay, from a leadership perspective, if we stay in that like pre-conventional conventional notion, we just won't have the capacity to see, I mean, like, if we look, I think there's still so many leaders that are running organizations today are 2-3 generations removed now from those that are coming in the door and being employed. Like, you have to be able to take on these different perspectives to be able to envisage what the future looks for those new employees. So I think that for me is a real challenge in terms of organizational productivity. If it's driven from a real expert achiever level, which is still reasonably selfish in its manifestation, I'm not sure that the organizations that stay in that mindset and in that culture will be successful into the future. So
do you touched on something that I think is on many people's minds, the younger generation coming into the door, into workplaces through the door, and whether are you seeing something different in them in terms of, almost their outlook on this developmental kind of journey? Do they come at it from a different point than maybe we did when we started working?
Certainly the people that I'm working with, the younger generation, they get it so fast, really fast. And, my experience is that they're really hitting redefining and post-conventional stages really early in their journey. And but just they are so much more aware of, the environment, like a more global perspective, from such a young age. They're aware of issues. They are, they're they see all of the problems of the world really early, and they're not prepared to just, they're not prepared to be diplomat. They don't just want to fit in. They don't just want to belong. They're already joining organizations with much more mature sense making than I had at that age, for sure, 100%. So I do think it's an imperative on leadership to be able to understand and be able to engage with that next generation coming into organizations in a way in which is going to keep them engaged and keep them working.
Yeah, so it's almost creating a developmental pressure for leadership to catch up with that
I
later
think
stage
so.
really worldview that
I
that beginners in the work, but not necessarily beginners in their development.
No, that's right. And I think the challenge that that's going to create within organizations is where you have people in more senior leadership roles that are still, earlier stage development center of gravity, and a younger generation of a later stage, already more mature sense making. That's going to create like a cultural clash that will really be challenging for those leaders. And overall, that means it's a challenge for the organization because we'll end up with a revolving door of that young talent just coming in and going, this is not the right place for me, and moving on.
Yeah. So that brings me to my last big question for you. Facing this challenge, this clash of cultures, in a sense, of developmental cultures, from the perspective of a learning and development leader who is creating that environment of learning for the whole of the organization, the new and the more senior, and holding all of that. Is there anything that you've learned on your journey so far that you feel people in your role in organizations could benefit from? Maybe a piece of advice or a share of hard-won lessons or nuggets of wisdom that could be useful to people leaders.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think you have to know and own your own story. I think that for me is one of the most critical parts of this work. Because I think it's very hard for a leader or a coach or an L&D developmental person to really connect with the needs of others until they've done the self analysis and understand that themselves. And really, there's some very simple tools like the transformation cards is such a simple and like a cost effective entry point into this conversation. And again, you can do it. So that's when you're looking at scale. Some of the tools are quite expensive, and there's a bit of a barrier to entry there, but transformation cards is a really simple one that can be done at scale, and it allows people to just be able to go, I had a past, I have a present, and I'm in control of what the future might look like, and what has been the catalyst between, past and present, what will be the catalyst between present and future. So I think that things like that are simple tools that allow you to work at scale and create sort of a common narrative around vertical development without getting very caught up in the theory.
Mm. Thank you, Marty. Is there anything you're reading at the moment that you're finding really interesting?
I am. I'm reading Valerie Livesay's new book on fallback, and I'm finding that it's really enlightening, and it's very easy to follow, and I'm looking forward to, in my next iteration of my program next year, of being able to explore the idea of fallback in more depth with my next cohort, as we go through that next year. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to integrating that into the program.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm also reading Valerie's book at the moment and having all sorts of insights about how the worst moments of our lives potentially can be some of our best moments. Not in
Yeah.
that moment,
No.
but later on. It's definitely a beautiful, enlightening book on adult development that I think more people should read. And
Absolutely.
I'll also put it in the resources. Marty, I am deeply grateful to you for agreeing to have this conversation with me. I've learned a lot, and I've learned a lot from all of the conversations we've had so far. And thank you for doing the work you're doing and for um, walking the talk. which I think is the hardest thing to do. It's so easy to talk about this stuff. It's so much harder to actually try to integrate it in the way we live and the way we work.
Yeah, thank you. And likewise, Alice, it's been really fun having this conversation, and looking forward to hearing more.
I hope you've enjoyed what has been for me a very honest and soulful conversation about walking the talk of adult development in our lives and in our work. I'm hoping you might take a few insights from Marti's experiences. The few things that have stuck with me are the idea that you can only support others' growth if you are willing to do the hard work of growth yourself, and that the process of adult development is inherently uncomfortable. So it's a discomfort that you have to choose to step into. And then as a leader, what Marti was talking about was the vulnerability of being able to invite others into your journey and show them the ups and the downs as you have experienced them, to then create that psychological safety, that trusting environment where people can actually open up and reflect on their own growth. So then they can become capable to take those insights into hopefully more mature behaviors with their teams if we're talking about leaders. And one last idea that stuck with me, and I'm going to reflect on it quite a bit after this conversation, is the potential gap we're seeing in organizations between the developmental octaves of younger people coming in who are looking for purpose and meaning and have an awareness of the complexity and the huge challenges of the world in a way that perhaps their bosses did not have when they started. So this clash, this developmental clash between the expectations and the worldviews of Gen Zs coming into the workforce, and what kind of developmental catalyst this becomes for leaders to continue to grow themselves up. So with all this in mind, I'm hoping this will give you some welcome opportunities for reflection. Do check out the podcast page where I've put a bunch of resources for you to dive deeper into some of the topics and some of the thinkers that Marti mentioned in this conversation. And I'll see you in January for another guest and another lens on adult development. Until then, stay well, stay true, and continue growing yourselves up.